This is RTP. This is RTP180.
So what I'm going to talk about is actually not the core of what I do for my research, but I am the current chair of the Committee for Adapting to a Changing Climate of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about adaptation and actually getting into a historical perspective here. So and try to bring a positive side and that actually each one of us has an important role to play in how we think the future forward. So I'm going to start with, by looking at the Roman Empire, because it's an example that I think most of us probably learned in history. And of course, the Han invasions who ended or were a big trigger of the ending of the empire. And linked to this, though, the stirrup, which was an essential piece of technology, right, that kept the Huns on their horses and made them incredibly effective. And so it really changed, actually, a lot of the social structure in Europe after the stirrup was introduced. Then I want to advance a little bit and look at what happened after Portuguese and Italian and Dutch and British and so on went all over the world and started bringing in food and different types of seeds and so on. And this is actually the history of the potato famine in Ireland, which actually the potato is originally from Peru, but the pest that actually caused the potato famine came from Central America. And then it all traveled in boats to Europe, and after that it started the second great migration after the Huns, which is basically what we have still going on today, of migrants all over the world moving around. And then finally, I really want to emphasize that we are very fortunate to live in our times. We have amazing technology, we're very smart, have made immense progress. And so, between climate, which is very positive in so many ways and can be threatening, but with technology and culture, there's actually a lot of good things that we can do, and so look towards the future in a positive way. So let me start by showing you this record of floods in the Nile. And what's interesting about this record is that it's not just about the floods, but it's more a record that if there was a flood, was it a good flood? Meaning that if you look at the top right corner, you would have water invading all, flooding over the fields and settling down silt that was very good soil to then seed and have good harvests. And so what you see in this time series here are basically a record of the floods that took place at the time. Some of them were great, they got huge areas flooded. Others were not so great, the areas were much more limited, but still a lot of flooding. So when you look at this time series that starts in minus 30 BC and goes into a little bit above 700 BC, what you see is that in the beginning, up to the 300, we had lots of floods in this region of the world, and after that, we don't see so many. And so some people will say, well, that's because the records were not really that good. Others would argue, other historians would argue that the reason why we don't have any records of floods is because, good or bad, is because none of them took place. And so, but this was very important in history because this is exactly the time when Rome takes over Egypt. And of course, the Nile and the delta of the Nile was a huge source of food for the Roman army and people. And so we have this period between 100 and 200 AD, which was called the Roman optimum. So they were really flourishing and very powerful and very wealthy. And then after that, things started going bad, well, in part because of politics, but also because as you start looking at that record, you start seeing that the number of events is actually decreasing. So the variability is actually going away. And eventually, by the end of the beginning of the 4th century, actually there were big famines going on, in part because of politics too, because of armies going around, but also because of this lack of flooding. And it actually had important implications, not only in social terms, but also in economic terms. This was the first edit to actually set maximum prices for food. So all kinds of food were actually given a maximum price, and this was an anti-inflation sort of measure that Diocletian imposed because of the problems that these droughts, followed by famine and social strife we're bringing into the society of the times. Then we go through this period where the Huns were actually moving from East Asia and were already at the border of Eastern Europe, and then eventually the fall of the Roman Empire. So this is one of the types of data that we can use for climate, for paleoclimate analysis. Another type of data are tree rings. And so if you look at how the tree rings are close or far apart, you can tell whether it was a wet year or a very dry year. You have a really old tree, you count those, and we get sort of a record of how many droughts and flood years we had. So if you look at East Asia, what you'll see is that between 200 and 600, there were multiple droughts that were multi-decadal droughts. And so these were nomadic peoples that depended on the grasslands for their animals and so on. And so what we see is that as climate is changing and those droughts are powering through, we see them basically moving west. And that was the first great invasion or great migration in history as we tell it. And so, just for perspective, to give you a kind of a scale of what the Nile of the Delta looked like in comparison with the scales, the spatial and temporal scales that this great migration from East Asia actually encompassed. So then I want to move around and go quickly with this and say that as if you look at history, there have been many periods of very cold weather, and it seems that when we have cold weather, things go really, pretty bad very fast. And I want to point out, I won't spend a lot of time because I have to go, but in the early 1800s, along with the potato famine, which was effectively caused by a pest that came from Central America, the fact of the matter is that it was a very extremely cold period in Europe. And so you'll look at history and you'll see that most of these mass migrations and really dramatic changes in how people live and do business really happened associated with periods of extreme climate. And of course, I just wanted to bring a point. I talked about the stirrup before. I didn't want to leave out the steam engine, which actually facilitated, migrations and industrial development and so on, and brought us to where we are today. I do want to finish, and I'm sorry I'm going to be a little bit long, but I want to tell you the success story of American adaptation. I think this is a great example. It's still probably one of the top examples in the world of what people can do when they have the right mindset. So this is a picture of people climbing up electric poles in Dayton, Ohio, in 1913, in March of 1913, after a major flood. So it was really pretty bad. Hundreds of people died, thousands of horses, about 2,000 or so horses died. And as you can see from the dress of the time, it was a pretty bad situation. It was so bad that actually martial law was declared, also because of public health issues. And so they had already had a few floods in this river before, but nothing like this. This affected 3 major towns and so on. And it was really like one of those big aha moments, I think. And so the powerful people of the time, the politicians, the governor, the assembly, and some people key in the community actually were looking for somebody to help them solve this problem. They found Arthur Morgan, who was the president of Antioch College, and asked him to find a solution that would last, right? And so he actually went around. We didn't have any codes and guidance and methods at the time. He started it from scratch. And when he came back, he proposed a solution that required buy-in from the majority of the community. It was a solution that if you had a big extreme event, you would actually willingly provide your land to be flooded so the more valuable infrastructure in cities and so on would not be flooded. So this required that for the first time that a policy be put in place and approved by the state Assembly, which was the Ohio Conservancy Act of 1914, and it was really groundbreaking. And as a result of this, in a period of about 5 to 7 years, 5 of these great dams that are the size of the pyramids, each one of them, were built by thousands of people that moved in. They modified the Ohio River, built in levees, and flood walls and so on. And the implications of this, so over a time scale of 15 years, we went from thinking about flood protection as building just flood walls or levees to actually having a landscape integrated perspective on what flood control should be. And so I think this is a great example because it brings everybody together. It brings common sense, it brings engineers, it brings people that are working in agencies, and it brings in the public. And so everybody buys into a solution, and so it has worked. So about 5 or 7 years ago, they actually had to use some of that land for flooding, but it has worked very well over the last 100 years or so. And I will just end. I won't move any further, but I wanted to show you some results, this from our research, that are relevant for us. So Arthur Morgan was an impressive man who really had great ideas. And so FDR recognized that, and as part of the New Deal, he was the first person in charge of putting in place the TVA. And as you know, the TVA is also a great success in terms of course, people will have different opinions, but it is a great success in terms of water resources and energy and so on. But I wanted to show you that 100 years later, how we can measure one of the impacts of building all these dams. And Ben was talking about a different kind of impact, but what I wanted to show you are data analysis here from satellite over the last 10, 15 years, looking at cloudiness over the southern Appalachians. And these are for summer and springtime. And these are the number of days in the year where you have low-level cloud, basically the fog and the haze that you see when you visit, on top of the mountain ridges. And as you see, we have greens and reds, lots of them, as you'd expect. And then, do you see all those blues? Those blues are the TVA dams, are the lakes of the TVA dams. So what happens every afternoon is that we have land breezes forming, like the breeze that you have along the ocean. And I'm sure if you do sports in the lakes and so on, you have appreciated that. And so what this has done is created clouds actually far away from the lakes, in such a way that this lake infrastructure has actually changed completely the cloudiness in this region. And the size of this is the size of climate change in terms of impact on surface temperature. Thank you.